Hi, my name is Trinio Harvey. Welcome to my presentation on L2 varieties or international Englishes. But first, a very short statement of my viewpoint coming from Kachuru from 1996 with slight modifications by myself. So we have Kachuru's three circles of English, which attempts to explain the development of Englishes around the world after colonisation from empires such as Britain. We have the inner circle countries of the USA, UK, Australia, such like. And we have outer circle countries like India and Nigeria, which used to be colonies. And then we have the expanding circles, such as countries such as China, Russia, and Brazil, where English is not usually spoken. Okay, so we have the inner circle countries, the outer circle countries, and the expanding circle countries. We have there a special case of South Africa, which, even though it's in the expanding circle, I might just ignore for the moment. But we can see that the outer circle countries and the inner circle countries are norm providing. The inner circle has the L1 norm. The outer circle countries has L2 norms, or they are norm developing countries. The expanding circle are norm-dependent countries, or they get their L2 norm from other countries such as the outer circle or most probably the inner circle countries, because these may be seen to be exocentric and endocentric norms, where exocentric, the norms come from outside, and endocentric, the norms for the language come from inside. And we have exonormative and endonormative language varieties. Following from that, we have the exonormative language variety, which is based on the way a country's second language is used in the country it came from originally, rather than the way it is used by local speakers. Most outer and probably all expanding circle countries choose this. They use native speaking models because they have prestige and legitimacy. They have history. They are codified with standards of norms like dictionaries and grammars. And their learnedness can be tested and evaluated, such as IELTS and TOEFL tests. English language teaching materials are readily available with a mixture for global and localized markets around the world. The international organizations often they do compete to provide English language teaching expertise worldwide. Then we have the endonormative language varieties, which are based on the way a country's second language is used by local speakers rather than the way it is used in the country it came from originally. Most likely chosen by outer circle countries, and this local variety of English has become socially acceptable, though often fierce debate concerning the varieties used, where and why, and for example, for their institutional use. Okay, so we come to the dynamic model of second language variety formation from Schneider, which has 5 stages. The first stage is the foundation stage, beginning with the colony being settled and colonial expansion, leading to English usage being established by migrant functionaries and settlers. And the settlers coming from different regions and speaking different regional dialects obviously means that there's going to be dialect contact between the peoples and koinization. And the indigenous community, of some of which acquires a limited amount of English, which often leads to pidginization of the language. Toponymic borrowing of local place names also takes place. Stage 2, exonormative stabilization, has increased contact between the settlers and the indigenous population. The linguistic norm, which the colony accepts, is usually the external norm, such as the British variety. There is also increased second language usage of local people, with lexical nouns are increasingly found, such as words for the flora and fauna, local culture. The early early phonological and syntax transfer phenomena are seen as well. Stage 3 is called nativization, which is the essential phase of cultural and linguistic transformations taking place. The territory, or commonly, is quite often on the way to political and cultural independence, which this stage also involves expanded contacts and significantly reduced social contact between the descendants, social gap, between descendants of original settlers and locals. This leads to an increased amount of interaction with an emergence of structures distinctive to the newly evolving variety. This structural nativization involves its own lexis, sounds, and grammar. New linguistic habits become stronger among the indigenous population, but the settlers' descendants adopt them increasingly also. Stage 4 of this dynamic model involves endonormative stabilization, which usually happens after political independence and is associated with nation building. Both the settlers and indigenous population descendants increasingly identify as members of a newly born young nation, such as Aussies, marked by pride in itself and cultural self-dependence. Sometimes the transmission is marked or speeded up by a catastrophic event X. This clarifies the imbalanced mutual importance and the identity separation from the mother country. The public discourse tends to observe and emphasize homogeneity within the young nation, for linguistics and stuff like that. The codification of the new variety begins with local dictionaries and grammars. Literary creativity in the new variety is manifested deliberately as an example in symbolizing the new independent status. Stage 5, or the last stage, is differentiation. The new nation reaches an external stability with internal cohesiveness, and there is increasingly room for internal differentiation and a gradual emergence of new dialects and sociolects within the new variety. And we have then lots of different varieties of English. As you can see, we have often called the native English speaking or the inner circles varieties of English. Some outer circle varieties of English, which used to be ex-colonies of different empires. And this one, which is a special one by itself, which is ex-colony Dutch, though not English, and it has its own version of English. And something interesting here, which I thought, where we have BBC English and Network Standard English from British English and American English. Accordingly, keep this in mind for teaching English, I think. Anyway, World Englishes. Well, English as a medium is used by two different types of speech communities, which we need to keep in mind. One speech community perceives itself as monolingual and monocultural, which is often the native English-speaking or inner circle country. And the other speech community perceives itself as multilingual and multicultural. The varieties of English have a distinct literary and oral traditions and mythologies. And the norms they also have their own norms of literary creativity, and linguistic experimentations are not necessarily shared between the varieties. There are 4 myths of English language teaching and learning. The first myth is the interlocutor myth, where English is primarily learnt to communicate with native speakers. Well, the sociolinguistic fact, most of the interaction in English takes place among and between those who use it as an additional language. Monocultural myth. English is learnt to understand American or British culture. Only partly true. In reality, a major function is to impart native cultural values and traditions in culturally and linguistically pluralistic societies. It is a vehicle for integrative functions in a national sense. Model dependency myth. Exocentric models of English are taught and learnt in the global context. In reality, actual linguistic behaviour is that the endocentric models provide the major linguistic input. Cassandra myth. Diversification and variation in English across cultures is an indicator of linguistic decay. Controlling the decay is the job of native English-speaking teachers of literature and language, ESL professionals and professional organisations. I leave this one up to your own judgment. but I do not agree with this at all. So, which variety of English to teach or learn? Is usually an effect of the choices made by government for institutional use or educational policies, or it may be made by private forces such as international business and communication peoples or international schools, or community pressure. It may be made by personal choice of education, or even an accident of birth such as myself, where I learnt and teach Australian English. So basically, the version of English that you may have to teach, which may be British English, American English, or Filipino English, may not be set by you, but you can at least give your students knowledge that there are different versions of English out there. There are different attitudes towards languages, and these language attitudes, generally the prestige varieties, such as native English speaking or inner circle varieties, get given a positive evaluation. There are 4 factors which contribute to language status. This is the autonomy, the function of the linguistic system as distinct from others, as in is it its own, as in Australian English or British English or American English, the historicity or its history, how the language is believed to have developed over time, the standardization or codification of the language, which sets the norm for proper or correct usage, and the vitality, its widespread use by a strong group of native speakers. Or we have another view of language variety and linguistic capital, or how languages are valued, taken from Bourdieu. The value of the linguistic product is determined by various factors, including the field of exchange, how formal or informal, how integral language is to the exchange, the trader who's speaking and their social place, where the product was initially learnt, or which institution and social authority supports the product. The concept of the linguistic market involves 3 modifications of linguistic phenomena. The grammaticalness or acceptability should be replaced by legitimate language. The relations of communications are have to do with the relations of symbolic power. The meaning of speech may be taken from the value and the power of that speech. And the linguistic competence, which is also related to the symbolic capital of your linguistic repertoire, cannot be separated from your social position. All right, L2 varieties and identity, or the user's identity and their articulation of their own self, how they express their expression of how they want to be perceived as a person, as an individual, and as a member of a society. This involves choices, maybe unconscious choices with distinct cultural identity as a variety. For example, does this language variety have, is it Nigerian English? Is it known? The appropriate acculturation of their variety for socio-cultural, religious, and interactional contexts. The organisation of discourse strategies and speech acts which are unique to the L2 variety, and alteration of linguistic codes in multilingual contexts of the use of English. All these things have an effect on how a person identifies themselves with their language use. L2 varieties and teaching English to speakers of other languages. From some previous research done, we can see that student attitudes, for example, from countries in Hong Kong, Italy, Denmark, and Austria, there is a preference for received pronunciation, or the British version, the British variety, British English, which may be due to several factors, including the learner's L1 and previous attendance at language classes. Taiwanese students who went to the Philippines for English language lessons because it was closer and it was cheaper than going to the USA, most of them chose English as an international language as a preference for language to learn, a variety to learn, with 4 choosing American English, and of those two also chose British English. And these Taiwanese students also commented that the teacher or teaching quality was good, but they rather would have preferred an L1 accented teacher rather than a Filipino accented teacher. And these teachers perceive pronunciation differences cause difficulties for students listening. In Hong Kong, various non-native English-speaking teachers' attitudes were investigated. Most of these teachers considered British English to be beautiful or better than their own version of English. These non-native English-speaking teachers often look for advice on standards from external, not local sources. And they were often bound to exonormative models, not the Hong Kong English model. So they used exonormative models. If they were giving their own views, they often had to cite sources, prefacing their personal opinions with hedges and qualifications. They often asked for other teachers' views, signaling their own view was not final and malleable. English can be seen as an international language, and this has implications for English teaching. For example, English is used in a global sense and for international communications between countries, and is used as a primary function to enable speakers to share with others their ideas and culture. It's used in a local sense as a language of wider communications within multilingual societies, and English has become embedded in cultures of countries in which it is used. The use of English is no longer connected only to the culture of inner circle countries. When designing lesson activities and teaching about different L2 varieties in the classroom, do not forget that various points deserve attention when teaching. For example, the socio-linguistic profile of the forms and function of the English, the variety, exposure and sensitivity, attitudinal neutrality, the functional validity of varieties within a variety, the range and depth of its uses and its users, contrastive discourse and the pragmatics used in the language, the multidimensionality of functions of English, and the multiculturalism in content and creativity. These are all ideas for you to keep in mind when designing different learning opportunities for your students. There are three areas that you should concentrate to be able to facilitate intelligibility for L2 English speakers to help their pronunciation and to be able to make them more understood, basically increasing their linguistic competence. There are certain segmentals, for example, the core quality, which are needed to approximate for native speaker English varieties. Most consonant sounds, the distinction between long and short sounds, methods of cluster simplification and consonant deletion, the nuclear stress, the main stress in a word group, and also contrastive stress. Also, the effective use of articulatory setting, which is very holistic, for example, i.e., if the articulators are comfortably positioned, this assists in production, which underpins the first two areas, facilitating core sound production, and allows manipulation of core sounds to produce nuclear stress. Basically, this means, for me, my understanding is mouth and tongue movements and lips and things like that. Your students need to be able to do these things, and if they can get that done comfortably, it assists with producing the segmentals and nuclear stress. And other pronunciation features may be taught at a receptive level. These first two, I believe, should be taught explicitly, while the first three should be taught explicitly, while the pronunciation features at the receptive level may be taught implicitly. Some do's and don'ts for teaching differences between language varieties. Don't expect pupils to learn both and to be proficient in two dialects. Don't expect teachers to teach both. Do expect pupils to learn to understand both, but to be able to perform in only one. Do decide which form, American English, British English, Australian English, Singaporean English, Chinese English, Thai English, South African English is to be the dominant model, and concentrate on teaching that form. Teach fully one model, but give opportunities for hearing and reading others and to learn to understand them. But don't require speaking or writing more than one. What should be emphasised is they are alternatives. It is teaching English that matters, not teaching British English or teaching American English. Okay, this teaching activity draws the students' attention to the written vocabulary difference between the language varieties. You will need some handouts of British English and the British English and American English text, which is available from www.teachingenglish.org.uk. This contains vocabulary and definitions to be placed around the room, as well as one American style text and one British style text. In this lesson, the teacher should introduce the lesson by engaging the students' previous knowledge and eliciting vocabulary that the students know about the two different L2 varieties of American English and British English. And the teacher then produces the task by getting the students to group, so that we have pairs of students working with the American English text and pairs of students working with the British English text, and they can go around the classroom where you should have pre-placed already the definitions and the two different words that go with the definitions. So we have two different vocabularies. One is British English and American English, and the students must go around the classroom trying to decide which vocabulary is correct for which text. After that, the students and the teacher checks with the students the answers. We can have a discussion about the differences in the L2 varieties, any reasoning behind the L2 variety selection that the students might actually wish to learn, and any perceived difficulties of the L2 variety that they may have. Thank you. And this teaching activity draws the students' attention to spoken differences between language varieties using YouTube videos of different accents from around the world. The teacher can use this lesson to introduce the different L2 varieties, and the method for this, I'd say, is the teacher introduces the lesson by engaging the students' previous knowledge about these language varieties and eliciting any vocabulary they may have. The task I would propose would be for pairs of students to listen to the language or the vocabulary from one variety of English in the video, and then afterwards the students can discuss all this as either in bigger groups from the different varieties of English or as a whole class discussion. This listening task would propose to be playing the videos, and the students can listen with directed listening for certain words or varieties of language, and you could even have a piece of paper with it where they have to match the vocabulary to the country or vocabulary to meaning. Following this, we can have discussions between students and teachers about differences between the L2 varieties, for example, the accents, the vocabulary, or reasoning behind any L2 variety selections which these students prefer, and also any perceived difficulties of L2 varieties they may have encountered before or think they may have. An extension for this activity could be a role play. And finally, I'll leave you with this quote, paraphrasing from Cuttery's 1996, which you saw in the beginning. It basically states my viewpoint on L2 varieties of English. In society, as in farming, monoculture works poorly. It exhausts the soil, the social richness of our planet. So striking to the extraterrestrial comes from the diversity of its peoples, its capacity for cohesion, for some spirit of common agreement on what is to be done, comes from the willingness of those peoples not to elevate their cultural and linguistic differences into impassable barriers and ramparts. Thank you very much for listening.